I'm Big Don Luca, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
All right, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm joined here by my co-host, Jaren.
What is up, guys?
Today, we are going to be getting into the season in review for Christian Wood and Theo Pinson, continuing our season in review series. Jaren, give me a brief synopsis of Christian Wood's season on the Mavericks this past 2022-2023 season.
In one word, interesting. We'll say that.
Interesting.
Confusing.
Divisive.
All of the above.
Yes. So we'll be getting into that and the sort of just holistic situation from his on-court playing to the disconnect between the front office and the coaching staff and all the factors that went into a season that sort of segued into a probable departure from Dallas this coming offseason. At least that's what all signs point towards. But before we do that, here's an ad from our sponsor, Spotify for Podcasters. All right, Jaren. So getting back into it, starting with just the sort of chronological timeline of Christian Wood's just time here in Dallas, really going back to when the trade happened from those days when we had Grant on the pod where he was telling us that he was working out with Mavs assistant Sean Sweeney in regards to his defense. Things looked really promising, I guess, and the just sort of the media sort of led up to training camp, and then we had some quotes surface from Jason Kidd that kind of made everything seem a little like things were just going haywire with the situation, but not something where I think the alarm bells were ringing, just real loud yet. Obviously, there was the whole JaVale McGee starting center news, but we didn't really know how much credence to take to that at the time. We thought Christian Wood would still have a very prominent role or possibly even be started alongside JaVale McGee. And then obviously, the games and the action sort of ensues there in mid to late October, and the Mavericks get their season off the road. And, Christian Wood is coming off the bench at the start, but he has a few really good games. And he sort of goes to a bit of a slope, then kind of things resurface for him. And then he's able to kind of play good. And amidst some injuries to Mavericks big men, he actually is able to accrue the starting center role for the Mavericks amidst that 7-game win streak they had. Now, granted, during the 7-game win streak, I think a lot of people take a little bit too much credence to that because it was when Luka was really on Planet of the Apes mode and was, really stomping all over everybody like a gorilla. And the whole league was taken aback. And the Mavericks were also having, facing a very weak strength of schedule throughout that 7-game winning streak as well. And, they got a lot of luck with that whole Luka tip in versus the Knicks and everything. It was a fun little ride, but it was definitely not a ride without suspicion. I remember, looking at some of our podcasts before, Christian Wood fractured his thumb and that whole sort of sequence of him starting for the Mavericks. It was, riddled by a lot of skepticism towards the validity of the just sort of construct of the team and how good they could actually be. But we were enjoying the wins, at least, which was fun, something that we can't say happened at the end of the year. So just sort of take us through Christian Wood's time in Dallas. And, I kind of covered the whole first half. But, what sort of happened after that thumb injury ensued. And if you want to talk to Jason Kidd not starting him at the beginning of the season, you can do that as well. And then, what just happened around the All-Star break and post-All-Star break and just sort of the lead up to the offseason that caused us to get where we are today, where Christian Wood is tweeting that the real story will come out. Don't believe these articles. I believe in reference to a Tim Cato article that recently dropped that we'll be doing a podcast about later. But just a lot of sort of convolution on his part in terms of, I think, the want to be in Dallas, but also how he views he is getting treated. So what did you come to surmise about all of that?
Yeah, so Christian Wood was brought in that early offseason trade with the Houston Rockets. And some viewed it as a win now trade, and that of course, that quickly dissolved as Jalen Brunson packed his bags and headed to New York. And very quickly along the offseason, I think we realized, Christian Wood wasn't going to be this difference maker. Is he the second or third best guy on this team? I know that there was those arguments going around. And then of course, the news came out that he was likely not even going to start the beginning of the season, and JaVale McGee was going to take that starting center role. It was just, leading up to everything, and especially the beginning of the season, I would say the first 20 games of the season. I think it's just a kind of a confusing time, not only for Christian Wood, but just, for the fan base in general. I think, pretty much every, not know-it-all basketball fan, but, casual to respectable NBA fan, I think is the best way to put it, was questioning why Christian Wood wasn't starting. I know that, for me and Will, probably through the first 41 games, I would say the first half of the season, I know that we definitely made a handful of podcasts or a handful of segments and multiple podcasts, talking about discussing, why isn't he starting? Why isn't he getting more minutes? And quickly, I would say after that, we learned the real reason why. Post thumb injury, he was out for around 3 weeks. I think it was January 19th to like February 5th or something like that. So he was out for around 3 to 4 weeks with that fractured thumb. And, before then, I do think they won, or they went 9-4 in that stretch before that thumb injury, I do believe, which is like their best stretch at that time in the season. And, very quickly we did realize that, this team is very volatile to, injuries, and injuries pretty much taking away everything. And that's what happened. And I think the coaching staff, pretty much after that had their mind made up that, we weren't going to play Christian Wood the allotted minutes. And pretty much from February on to, early April, it was just very spotty minutes. One game here, he'd get 25 minutes, he'd score 28 points, something like that. And then the next he'd get 12 and have like 5 points. There just was never any consistency. And of course, pretty much towards the All-Star break, there was all this sort of talk, especially after the Kyrie trade, all this talk around, Twitter and everything, and even Christian Wood voicing his opinions, about trade rumors and everything like that. I just think, there was a lot of confusion through 82 games and, most of the summer last year. I guess just really the whole season for that matter. There's a lot of confusion surrounding Christian Wood and his camp. And, to be fair, I think that this was a situation that the coaching staff handled very, very poorly. The coaching staff and the Mavs PR for that matter, because, if you look at the All-Star sort of voting and everything, he was listed as, and this is from Tim Cato's article. I know we're going to get into this in a later podcast, but, he was one of the top 3 guys that the Mavericks were sort of, pining for votes on the Mavericks. And, of course, around that time, there were even talks of, extensions, because he was eligible for that mid-season contract extension for, I think it was like 2 years or 4 years, 77 million, something like that. But yeah, I think that there's just, either non-communication or just, weird mishaps between coaches and player. I think it led up to where we are today. And I would say confidently, I would, probably put it in the 80s to 90% chance that I don't think Christian Wood returns in Dallas. And, I would, if I were a betting man, I would bet in that favor that he'd probably go somewhere else other than Dallas.
Yeah, definitely. I think that almost everybody listening to this would agree with you from that standpoint. You referenced that, Christian Wood basically sort of, I guess after that thumb injury, he sort of kind of paved his own path in a sense to his downfall in terms of his minutes on the Mavericks. But maybe for other points in the season, you could say that wasn't the case. But you sort of alluded to that he, we found out the real reason is kind of what you said verbatim as to why he didn't play. What was that real reason before we get into the coaching staff and the sort of wrongdoings maybe and the mismanagement of the situation that persisted with the front office and coaching staff in tandem with the Christian Wood situation? what did he do specifically that led to him getting time off the court?
Yeah, I mean, I do know that for a while there, post Kyrie trade, because that's kind of whenever he came back from injury, was after the Kyrie trade. There was sort of looming question as, can Kyrie, Luka, and Christian Wood be on the floor at the same time? How do you fit in those minutes? Offensively, that's a lot of mouths to feed, quote unquote. That's a lot of offensive production that, isn't just being circled around. So from that, and then in tandem with defense, I know defense was a huge question pretty much throughout the whole entire season and off season. We know, it's not the best thing to produce. But yeah, I do think that there was points points in the season where, defense was, questioned and he lived up to the hype. And then there was definitely points where, defense was an absolute premium and we just got zero of it. So I think, from inconsistency, even on the offensive end at times, but especially on the defensive end, kind of led to his downfall, led to him, getting those sort of fluctuated minutes from, that 12 to 28 range or whatever it was that he would get from night to night. So I think, from inconsistency to especially the defense side of the ball, I think it's pretty fair. We know what Jason Kidd wants from his defensive unit. I don't think we saw it more than like 9 minutes and like half the game, or not even half the games, and like 25% of the games this year. So I think that you can even question that from a coaching standpoint. But, from an individual standpoint, I don't think Christian Wood helped his case at all on the defensive side, especially.
Do you think that Christian Wood's defensive lapses were enough to relegate him to the spot in the rotation that he was? Or do you think that his offense was enough to override that, and his fit with Luka and Kyrie, especially once the Mavericks, really kind of went full-fledged into that after the trade deadline. And, the defense was obviously just kind of torn to shreds with the departure of Dorian Finney-Smith, more so than it already was. What did you come to surmise in regards to if Christian Wood should have played more post-trade deadline, just due to defense kind of already being out the window? We might as well just go full-fledged on offense. And if you want to speak before the trade deadline, you can do that as well.
Yeah, I think, there was definitely some, points post trade deadline that, for Christian Wood, we just said it a minute ago, he didn't really help his case. I can understand the argument as to why he didn't really get enough playing time as he did on that side of things. Now pre-All-Star break, I do think, or pre-Kyrie trade, I should say, I do think that there was a legitimate argument to be made for, him getting more minutes. I think, later on down the season, consistency was a big thing. I think he should have gotten a lot more consistent minutes, because it kind of seemed like, depending on the matchup or depending on the team, he would get, again, as I said it before, like 12 minutes or 28 minutes. Like there was just no sort of in between, no consistency. Nothing that showed, that 15 to 20 minute range of what we would think. And, I just don't think that he really helped his case in that standpoint. So I'm not going to argue that. But I do think, there was a legitimate argument, a legitimate, sort of case to be made for him getting more minutes and more consistent minutes early on in the season. Because this team, yes, defense was at an absolute premium. Of course, we knew that what this team could do, especially with Dorian Finney-Smith and everything. So defense was, put on a stool that it wasn't, I guess later in the season, but even still, I do think that Christian Wood should have been included a lot more in the early season.
Yeah, I think, it can be sort of conducive to how he was playing at the time. There were a lot of points in the season, in my opinion, where his defense was prominent enough, and, he made enough of the right rotations. He was enough of a bug in his pick and roll defense to really warrant more minutes. And, there were times where it was just such a blatant sort of misfit that you need him at the game. So it's very divisive in nature, but I think I would agree that it was really just dependent on the time and, how he was playing within that given moment. And, could he have built upon more consistency in his on-court performances if he was playing more? I think that that's definitely a surfaceable argument that one could make, but just the sort of holistic aspect of his game this year was definitely riddled by inconsistency. If we want to just kind of take a step back and look to the off season, do you think that it's malpractice by the Mavericks front office to bring in a player of Christian Wood's caliber and then treat him sort of under the rug in the sort of manner that they did, with not even a starting role, inconsistent minutes? Or do you think that he's a player of a certain skill set that maybe is kind of going out of style in the NBA, that maybe isn't as coveted as it once was, and the Mavericks coaching staff was justified in the way that they managed him and his minutes this year, due to those defensive lapses?
I think, to me, this is probably the most frustrating part, is that this was all, in my opinion, avoidable. Yes, offensive center with absolutely or damn near zero defense, or just very little defense. Yes, that is a dying art, kind of in the NBA, but even still, he is a very weird player. He has a very weird play style, but I think that there is places to be made, places to be, that you might have to force your hand. But I do think that, he has a role, he had a role on this team that was, more than what he did, or more than what role he had. And, to me, that's why it's the most frustrating part, is because it kind of seemed like this, whether it was the front office, more so the coaching staff than anything. And then I think the front office pretty much backed the coaching staff in this, that, they were pushing away a player who, not only was on an expiring contract, but you had given up a first round pick. Granted, it was just going to be the 26th overall pick or 28th overall pick. But even still, that's a first round pick. We see now today how valuable those picks are, how valuable first round draft assets are. I think, if it was, if we knew, and of course you can say this for a lot of things, but if you knew what sort of situation we would be in today, or at least just a little glimpse into what the future would be like with Christian Wood in the lineup, I don't think the Mavericks would have given up a first round pick. Clearly there was some disconnect between the front office and coaching staff whenever they made that trade, because that's not a player that Jason Kidd, associates with necessarily. So I do think, that's, to me, the most frustrating part, is that this was completely avoidable. I do know at early points in the season, me and Will viewed this, and it's kind of funny looking back at it now, me and Will viewed this trade as a win-win trade. There was very little downside to this. You couldn't really lose this trade because you're getting a player, and at the end of the day, the worst thing that was going to happen was he was going to be an expiring contract.
And you trade him at the trade deadline.
Yeah, and you trade him at the trade deadline. And that very quickly turned into not only a negative asset, but a guy who, can be sort of viewed as, why would I want to go to Dallas? They did this to this guy. Why would I want to go to Dallas? It's not an honest organization, things like that. So in my eyes, I think that this was the most frustrating part, was the disconnect between the coaching staff and front office, and how the coaching staff handled this situation, because it was completely avoidable in my eyes.
Yeah, no, I would definitely tend to agree with you, because, just given the nature of the situation with how, his minutes were mismanaged all year and everything, he, very clearly is like on this certain, pedigree as a player, of a guy that, around like NBA circles and, between players is kind of seen as underrated. And, I do think that just from an asset management perspective, his name at least holds a little bit of weight to it, even if, the defensive slopes and downsides have sort of tanked upon that value a little bit, between GMs and stuff. But, I know The Athletic reported their player only survey towards the end of the year recently, and players coveted him as one of the more underrated players in the league. So he definitely has a, bright offensive impact on the game. That is irrefutable, to say the least, especially, in the right lineups, in the right combinations. His defensive downfalls can sort of be subsided. If you're playing him in those two big lineups and you're asking him to guard, guys more that are, positionally listed, from maybe a shooting guard, small forward, or a power forward, I know it's positionless nowadays, but guys like in that 2 to 4 sort of height and weight range, Christian Wood was able to sort of furbish a fairly decent stand against, as a perimeter defender, but he obviously had his very distinguishable slopes as the lone rim protector out there, even if the block numbers could sort of convolute that argument. So I do think that his defense led to a lot of the negatives that sort of came his way in regards to his minutes, but the asset management was very atrocious on the Mavericks part because despite how little Jason Kidd may favorite or fancy Christian Wood in a certain lineup or in the starting lineup, whatever, they shouldn't have gave up a first round pick for a guy that they basically were almost kind of facilitating to get out the door, basically doing everything in their power, almost making it a sort of head-to-head thing with the coach or with the coaching staff and Christian Wood from the beginning of the season. It almost seemed as if it was like this sort of prove it deal all year, and Christian Wood, I guess, wasn't able to capitalize upon that within the coach's perspective, and he obviously bared the negative consequences of that, and that was not getting minutes, and obviously a lot of discontent on his part in terms of his time in Dallas. And he's saying stuff now like the whole story will come to the forefront soon when I tell it one day, which will probably be in like 6 years, on when he decides to do some sort of 105.3 radio interview when he's an assistant coach with the Spurs. So it is just a very like screwed up situation from that perspective. And if the Mavericks really had no intention of his development and no intention of being able to get him on the floor to work through some of those woes that he's experiencing, whether that's defense, whether that's effort, whether that's rebounding, then that simply was just a not a well thought out process from top to bottom, from the front office to the coaching staff. I know that trades can sometimes be made within a moment's notice, and you kind of just have to go for it. But I just can't get past the fact that there weren't any preemptive conversations leading up to this that discussed top to bottom his fit within the organization, how Jason Kidd would like him, because regardless of window more specifically comes something, and regardless of if Jaden Hardy would have been the 26th pick in the draft regardless for the Mavericks, and where they sort of coveted those guys, they ended up getting Hardy still, even though they had to trade 2 seconds. You can make all the sort of contingency plans as to why this really didn't matter, but they, at the end of the day, they at least have 2 future seconds if they decide not to make this deal. So it definitely begs the question as to why they did any of this in the first place. And to your point, Jaren, why this whole situation was so avoidable yet so frustrating, regardless if you're in the camp that Christian Wood should have played more or you didn't like his fit in Dallas. So just barring all these sort of antics that persisted in regards to his minutes that I definitely wanted to touch up on, I think that we'll continually touch up upon it as we dive into some of these questions here. But these are some of the more integral questions that we want to hit on our season in review. So let's just go ahead and start knocking them out like we would do with some of the other players, and with of course the context of how Christian Wood's season unfortunately kind of came to a dwindling sort of end there. So Jaren, just first off, what did you come to make of Christian Wood's time in Dallas from an on-court perspective? What were his strengths and weaknesses, and what were some of the things that he was able to capitalize upon the most in his time here?
Yeah, I think, on the court, you don't really have to argue much. Outside of defense, I think his play was pretty great. Especially pre-Kyrie trade, whether it was the pick and roll, he was honestly the main catalyst in being that short man in the 4-on-3 situation. I think he did probably the best job at that out of anybody on this team. And I mean, his just ability to, be a secondary scorer was, nonetheless the only guy that could really do that. I mean, Spencer Dinwiddie at times was able to do it, but I think Christian Wood, especially pre-Kyrie trade, was probably the best man at that job. Even whenever he wasn't starting, he was still doing that. I mentioned the pick and roll, those numbers, I think that they were just behind Dwight Powell, if I'm not wrong, on the team, like in terms of either points per possession or points per roll or whatever it was. I think that they were just behind Dwight Powell. And even, his shooting efficiency, I think they went way up comparatively to last year. He actually had, somewhat of a controlled role, which I guess is probably the only positive that you can take away from his role. He shot 37.5% from three, and then 51.5% from the field. So overall, pretty good shooting numbers from, a guy that, isn't shooting it, or I guess he is shooting it at a pretty good volume depending on the, matchup or night. And I do know those first 5 games he made he shot like 60% from three or something like that. Like he had some incredible run at the beginning of the season from three. So I think, from that on the court play, he did a really good job on offense, and then on the flip side of things on defense, there's a lot of, questions, a lot of, just sort of things that I think went over his head. I don't think, going into Dallas, he really realized, how much intangibles go on the defensive side of the ball, or necessarily that, or if he just never had that in his career, from a coach or from a role, having that big of a defensive stand. So I think, on the defensive side of things, yes, there was a lot of questions going into this season, but even still, you could see at times the potential that was there, whether it was the shot block or weak side shot blocking, I should say, whether it was the weak side shot blocking, or just, even being a big at times. Like he was guarded up one-on-one. Granted it was against the Lakers and Anthony Davis was out, so it had to be Wenyen Gabriel, but still, he did a good job being a one-on-one defender inside the paint, and he had like 5 blocks that game, and he had a stretch of like 7 games or 5 games where he had 2 or more blocks for every start that he had. So I do think that there was some positives to take away, and there was some potential there that you could definitely see. But, on the defense, I guess, was more of the negative aspect of his game, more so than the offense.
Yeah, we sort of got the full array of the Christian Wood experience, I think, that we were predicting in terms of how he was going to play when we went into this. I think that there was some maybe, unsolicited or unwarranted, that we can, I guess, label now because it didn't come into fruition. Maybe some unwarranted sort of optimism that he was really going to be able to bolster his defense a little bit and be a guy that, could at least comfortably guard on the perimeter and, be a sort of pseudo rim protector when he needed to be, if he was able to add a little bit of size, just at least be a guy that could be competent. And I think a lot of us were optimistic that the defensive intangibles that and the sort of effort stuff that we saw persist in some of his earlier stops in his career when he was on worser teams, given the Mavericks were the first, I guess, technically one of the better teams he's been on, which sounds kind of crazy to say, but just given that much, I think that there was some optimism from the fan base that he would be able to really blossom into something on that end that was at least average, to where the defensive woes wouldn't be something so persistent that they kept him from playing long stretches of minutes in crucial points of games. And to the coaching staff's credit from this aspect, I don't know if it ever got to that on a consistent basis. It definitely stayed more in the sort of spotty realm or category, where we saw these flashes of him being able to guard in the perimeter. When the Mavericks lost Dorian Finney-Smith after the Kyrie trade, and we really saw the perimeter defensive woes come to a forefront, we started to see a lot more guys getting funneled toward the rim. And there were a few times that Christian would actually handle that pretty well. But, more often than not, as you kind of said earlier in the podcast, that you thought it was like 25-75, the amount of like good defensive games comparable to the bad ones, basically like a 1-to-4 ratio. I would maybe say it was more like in the 1-to-3 ratio. Maybe once every 3 games, he would have a good defensive game. And, we'd be questioning who this player is and why isn't he playing more. But, you know, also taking into context that he's had all these defensive lapses, I would say, you know, that happens sort of one every 3 games. And, you know, you need to at least build a portfolio where you can do it, you know, at least every other game, be a competent defensive player. And, you know, to the coaching staff's credit, like I said, he just wasn't able to do that from, you know, multiple aspects defensively, you know, whether, like I said, whether that be, you know, his rim protection, or his man-to-man defense or his post defense. It seemed as if, you know, every unique matchup provided something that could, you know, fracture his defensive ability in a different way every time. But, you know, there were certain matchups he thrived against. And, you know, you want to be a guy in the NBA that warrants, you know, different matchups, that has opponents trying to throw different things at you, you know, throwing the kitchen sink at you to try and stop you. But more often than not, on defense, at least, Christian Wood definitely seemed to be the latter, almost like opponents were trying to pick apart his weaknesses and put him in, you know, these scenarios where they could easily exploit him. So, you know, just being a guy that's matchup dependent versus a guy that, you know, warrants mismatches is a huge, you know, different. That's a huge dichotomy there. And as well as, you know, the offense being very good, and, you know, him getting those face-up opportunities against opposing big men and even smaller guards, being able to take advantage of them sometimes, but sometimes just simply not having the size, and sometimes getting disrupted by these sort of bigger wings in a Kristaps Porzingis like 2021 playoff series sort of esque way. You know, that definitely, I think, attributed to some of the limitations we saw on the court from him. Just, you know, his inability to adapt to different play styles would be my sort of debrief upon that. But I think overall, if I had to at least diagnose whether he should have played more or not, I would say that he should have at least got on the floor on a little more of a consistent basis to build up more of a pedigree as a player and to prepare him for, you know, scenarios in the latter half of the season, as the Mavericks would have, you know, presumably edged towards the playoffs had they made that run. But he obviously didn't. And, you know, the coaching staff deferred otherwise, and, you know, really, you know, hit the nail on the head in terms of asset mismanagement. A lot of the Christian Wood scenario was strictly asset mismanagement. You know, if we were just talking about on a, you know, strict player basis, you know, I think I'd be a little bit more keen to the argument as to why he wasn't playing. But there were points of the season where it was just even a little bit more egregious, considering even, you know, some of the defensive negatives and slopes, how little he was seeing the floor for different stretches, particularly post Kyrie trade. And you can definitely tell that there's something up behind the scenes. We just don't quite know what it is, which I think will definitely be a sort of bothersome tone that's going to be at the forefront of the situation until he leaves Dallas. And honestly, really, until we find out the true reason as to why everything went as sideways as it did. Because, like I said, there were definitely, you know, where there was a spottiness aspect and inconsistency aspect of his game that warranted some of the inconsistent minutes he got, but definitely not to the degree that it sort of occurred at. So just given that, Jaren, what do you think was probably the thing that he improved upon the most, and the thing that, you know, maybe took the biggest hit to his game in his first year, where he, you know, this sounds sideways saying it's the Mavericks, but in his first year that he, you know, joined a quote unquote winning organization, at least a team coming off a Western Conference Finals. So they were at least viewed at that as the time, contrary to his previous, you know, stops at like Houston, Detroit, and Milwaukee, where he was in, you know, definitive losing scenarios.
I think his role, or like Milwaukee, I think was actually the first seed of that year, but or if that was a 2019 year, I'm not sure. Anyways, I think, the thing that he improved upon the most, this
Well,
was
he
something.
hasn't made the playoffs in his career, so
Yeah,
he
yeah,
wasn't.
he's never made
Yeah,
the playoffs in his career. So because he was cut from Milwaukee by that point or traded, something like that.
yeah.
I do think, the thing that he's probably improved upon the most, or at least the thing that surprised me the most. And this was something that you could see, in highlight videos, or if you listen to some sort of Rocket scout who is sort of directing things towards the Mavericks fans or whatever, was sort of his perimeter defense. I think his perimeter defense probably surprised me the most. From a quote unquote bad defensive player. We had been sort of highlighting his perimeter defensive presence, whether it was guarding guys like Steph Curry, which was probably the highlight of his defensive time in Dallas, was that one possession that he had on Steph Curry at the end of the shot clock. I think that's probably the thing that surprised me the most, his ability to not only stay foot speed for foot speed, but also just not allow the player to get to where they want to be. Now, granted, there was a handful of times where if there was a player, on the sort of same tangible as him, height wise or speed, or height wise or weight wise, he did have a little bit of a problem there. But I think, whenever it was on the smaller guys, like a Steph Curry or someone else like of that sort of point, he was able to keep up with him foot speed. And if not keep up with him, he was able to get, a block, whenever he was beat on that point of attack. So I think from that point of view, that's probably the thing that surprised me the most. Offensively, I don't think there was really anything that surprised me too much. His ability to create his own offense was always something that was highlighted in Houston. He never really had to have someone side by side with him to get, to really just score for that matter. I think his fit with Luka, we knew would be pretty seamless, just because of his, aspirations through the pick and roll, whether it was with Jalen Green or some other point guard in Houston at the time. So I don't think that there was really anything, in question with that. If anything, maybe offensively, his sort of scramble offense, and what I mean by that is being the short roller in the 4-on-3 situation, his ability to be a playmaker and that sort of realm was honestly, I think it was not a dream come true, but it was something that nobody else on this team could really do. He was able to dish out to the corner shooters, or dump it off to the dunker spot. Something that I don't think whether it was Dwight Powell or even Maxi Kleber at times, nobody else on that roster could do. And I think he was really the only guy that could produce anything out of the situation. I know once Kyrie came in, it was a little different. That situation didn't really happen a whole lot. But pre-Kyrie, that was definitely something that happened quite a bit, was the double on Luka at the top of the key. And it was pretty much all up to him to be, either a playmaker or a facilitator, and he did exactly that. So I think that, offensively, that's probably the thing that surprised me the most.
Yeah, no. What would you say defensively surprised you the most from? Well, now you obviously talked about his perimeter defense. I just completely went blank on that. But I think I would probably agree that his passing was probably the most surprising aspect of his game. I remember Tim Cato writing an article about that after like the first game or two. His ability to create out of those 4-on-3 scenarios and just find cutters going backdoor and really being an outlet for when Luka had to defer to the drag dribble and was getting hard pressed at the top of the key. That was a pretty big wrinkle that I think the Mavericks didn't opt to exploit as much as I think they could have. We saw Josh Green be that outlet guy at times for the Mavericks earlier on in the season, and just kind of in tandem with him and Christian Wood, I thought that the Mavericks could have utilized both of those guys a little bit more, and Kyrie in that situation versus times where he would just be standing in the corner, post Kyrie trade. So I think that they definitely had some capable offensive weapons to facilitate those actions, but it just seemed like more often than not, they would, just try to pass it around the perimeter until they could find a wide open three, for a team that had a very heavy 3-point shot diet. So that's definitely on from a coaching perspective, I think something that they could have done a little bit more. But I would concur with you that was probably one of the just strong suits overall in terms of his time of Dallas that surprised me that we didn't really even hear about. Like, we heard a little bit about the perimeter defense from some of the Houston guys going in, but we hadn't heard anything about his passing. So I would definitely agree with you that, if I had to pinpoint something that he improved upon the most from his, earlier days, I would just say playing within a system, playing within a team and being able to find the open man, just playing more selfless basketball. And I mean, there were times where guys kind of labeled him a ball hog this year, while he did have a sort of full complement of mistakes that he made on his palette this year. I don't know if being too selfish was ever one of them. There were maybe some times where, he definitely tried to take some heat checks on some face ups and some heat check threes, but it was never to a point where I felt like he was sacrificial to the offense in its entirety. There were times where it was a bit of a clunky fit if there was another front court player out there like Dwight Powell or just certain lineups, but there was never a time where I felt like his inclusion on the offense was, completely sacrificial to the team, So with that being said, what do you think his biggest improvement that needs to be made just as a player in this league is going to be next year, even if he's not back in Dallas?
Yeah, I do think that's probably pretty clear he probably won't be back in Dallas, but even still, I think at least the last few players that we've talked about, it's been finding a role to get back in the NBA or finding a role to be, a decent intermediate role player. But I think that this guy is a pretty sure role player. I think, it's pretty confident, or I'm pretty confident in saying that he'll be in the NBA for years to come. So I don't think
you're that confident in his game.
I am that confident in his game because yes, he's a very weird player, but I do think that, he has skills and intangibles that many centers just don't have. And I would be interested to see him at the 4. I know that, the Maxi Kleber lineups and everything have sort of enticed. So I don't think that's going to, improve his value by any means, but I think if he can get paired up with the right guy, he'd probably be showcased as one of the more underrated guys. So anyways, but back to the point. I think, definitely, in my opinion, one of the things that needs to improve the most is just defensive consistency. And not just that, but, being, I guess like a role player on the defense side of things. I feel like his defense was either just god awful at times or, his shot blocking was amazing. Like there's just really no in between. He was either a complete black hole, or he was, a pretty average guy. Like I don't think that there's really in between. So I think if you could find some consistency and improve, his sort of defensive intangibles, that being like, hip speed and, agility and everything like that. I think if he could improve his defensive intangibles, and hopefully he really does take into account of everything that's happened in Dallas and sort of uses that motivation to become a better sort of basketball player. I think that if he does all that, and he's 27 years old. It's very questionable. Still, he's kind of not getting up there, but getting up there in the sense of making huge improvements in your game. So I think if he can improve upon that and just become more consistent at that rate, it doesn't even have to be an average defender, but someone who isn't completely like discounted and is looked at as
do what he does more consistently and not be just a black hole. Because I mean, when he's on, I wouldn't even call him like a great defender. I'd say slightly above average defender. That would definitely do wonders for his game. So I mean, obviously, we're both fair believers in Christian Wood's game and talent. We've sort of been on that train since the beginning of the season, contrary to other people. Do you think that the fit in Dallas just sort of came at the expense of it not being fully able to be optimized because of the roster personnel, and he was kind of forced into a scenario where he wasn't going to play up to his fullest potential as a basketball player? Or do you think that it was more conducive to himself and him not doing the things that would make him an integral part of the Mavericks rotation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is, honestly something that's probably going to be argued about all off season. To me, I think, the role, or at least the situation that he was brought into, was not one that was sort of comforting for him. And not just that, but like, I don't think he was very welcomed in Dallas. Whether it was the coaching staff being, negligent on his department, or just, pretty much getting thrown out the garbage door. Like, I don't know. There's just never really a chance for him, in my opinion. So I think, the situation that he was kind of brought into was something that, never really warranted him, getting a big enough role to be, a complete difference maker. I think at the end of the year, you can make that argument that as a player, he didn't really make any improvements to at least, open the eyes of Jason Kidd or, Sean Sweeney, whoever it was that was sort of, directing that. So, he didn't help his case in that scenario, but even still, I think, early on in the season and pretty much throughout the middle of the season, I think, it was pretty clear in my eyes and, I think a lot of people's eyes that it almost was like Jason Kidd just didn't want to use him. Like, it didn't really matter what he did on the court. He just refused to put Christian Wood on the floor. So I think the situation that he was kind of brought into was, not at fault. Yes, as I said, his play later on down the season was definitely questionable to say the least, but I still think, the situation that he was sort of brought into was one that was not welcoming for him and one that didn't treat him too nice.
Yeah, and I mean, even towards the end of the season when we both had Kyrie and Luka, leading the point of attack for the Mavericks. I know we talked about this with Grant a little bit more, but just the fact that there would be, some offensive slippage just given the amount of traps and double teams at the point of attack with those guys, with the Mavericks having, fully sacrificed their defense at that point with Dorian Finney-Smith being gone. I mean, why not throw him out there a little more? You obviously talked about that being maybe too many mouths to feed, but at the same time, Christian Wood isn't as much of a, I guess, I think the sort of narrative that he needs his touches was a little bit overblown and maybe sort of kind of dissipated out from the whole KP scenario where, Mavericks fans were used to that play style and sort of kind of penciled in Christian Wood as a 1-for-1 comparison to Kristaps Porzingis, which I think is just kind of a fallacy and a disservice because I don't know. I do think they're two completely different players. I do think Christian Wood doesn't necessarily, like we saw him many times this year where he didn't necessarily need to, have those face-up possessions and post-up possessions and seals to be largely effective. He could do that at times, against lesser competition and against opposing benches. But more often than not, I felt like he got like a majority of his points within the flow of the offense. Like me personally, I just never felt like that was something that was sacrificed with his time in Dallas. So I think that my sort of synopsis would be to summarize his time in Dallas would be disastrous, going back to that sort of one word quote at the beginning of the pod, because it was just a mismanagement from both sides to an extent. I mean, more so the Maverick side for bringing him in the first place. I do think Christian Wood's still an NBA player. I do think that he needs to improve a lot of the facets upon his game. And I don't think that he was really optimized given the personnel of this Mavericks team. And I can understand why his role sort of came at a certain expense, just given the sincere lack of defense on this roster. But, I do think he could thrive in another system. I don't think he's a bad locker room guy. I think he gives pretty good effort throughout most portions of the game. He's just got to be paired, probably with another rim protector where he can sort of freelance as the low man and, kind of be able to guard threes and fours. He actually might prove as a capable player, especially if the other guy's stretching the floor and you can get him going towards the basket a little bit more. There is a lot of credence to the stuff that we talked about with Grant in terms of how Christian Wood was just, not optimized in his time in Dallas. And, that comes down to just being a disaster from the start, from the disconnect from the coaching staff to the front office. And, Jason Kidd, for whatever reason, not opting to play him, but, Nico Harrison obviously giving up a first round pick. Was this just more of a test to see if it would work? And then if he didn't adapt to Jason Kidd's, exact likeliness or, likeness for that matter, was this just supposed to be something that was thrown out the door? And if so, and, he didn't adapt to Jason Kidd's likeness in the manner that he wanted, were they not able to trade him at the trade deadline because his value was tanked so low, as reported by guys like Kevin O'Connor and Zach Lowe? Or were they just not able to trade him at the deadline because they wanted to see what would happen going into the summer? Because there was obviously this sort of increasing lead up towards the end of the season, around the Kyrie trade, that we thought, okay, like they're just going to judge how he plays at the end of the season and try to re-sign him from there on out. And a lot of fans kind of became content with that narrative, but seeing as that we're at the end of the season and we're probably going to lose him for nothing after giving up a first round pick initially, Or if you want to look at it as 2 seconds, because the Mavericks would have traded for Jaden Hardy regardless, or selected him with that 26 pick, you can do that still. But nonetheless, those would still be valuable assets going into an offseason where the Mavericks desperately need assets, where they finished with a 37 and, am I correct on that?
44.
37 and 44 record. No,
38.
45, 38. Oh my God. A 38 and 40. I completely forgot the Mavericks record because last season was just such an albatross and I want to throw it out the window. But yes, a 38 and 44 record. In a season like that, you just can't afford to lose around the margins with a move like Christian Wood. I don't care if it's just a $14 million expiring contract. I don't care if, he didn't perform to certain, statistical, or, on court sort of thresholds that you hoped he would defensively. I don't care. Like, they losing around the margins, especially with this team, has gotten to a point where they just lose so much in that aspect that it adds up to being, a pretty vital loss. And they screwed up. All signs kind of point towards Christian Wood leaving the team. Obviously, with how he's been operating on Twitter with his likes and his comments. The Mavericks social team actually just came out with a thread talking about some of their favorite stats from Christian Wood this year, and they were like showcasing it on Twitter, which is kind of funny. And he liked and retweeted all of it. So, I mean, who knows you never know if there would just be some major upheaval and the Mavericks pick Christian Wood's side instead of Jason Kidd. But I think that is the last thing that would happen given Mark Cuban's comments. I think it's more probably likely than not that Christian Wood is on his way out and Jason Kidd's remain coach in Dallas, and the Mavericks just screwed this up by bringing him in the first place, just given their prerogative towards not playing him and their unwillingness to adapt or try to, optimize his play style, given the sort of nature of the player he was. Could he have worked harder, done a few things better? Yes. And I earnestly believe he probably doesn't fit with this roster idealistically as much as you'd hoped, but given how just talent deficient the Mavericks were last year, surely they could have optimized him a little bit better and, involved him in some scenarios that would have been probably more beneficial to the team, because despite his defensive shortcomings, the Mavericks were so bad defensively at times, we'd reckon that we just want the extra, added offensive punch that he provided, and he just didn't get a chance to showcase that as much as he wanted. That kind of goes into my surprising stat, which was Christian Wood's minute total this season. I believe it was his average minutes played per game, of course, and I believe it's the lowest in a few years. He clocked in at 25.9 minutes per game, which was the lowest since his days in Detroit, where he played 62 games, averaging 21.4 minutes per game in the 2019-20 season, before he really blossomed into the player that he sort of became with the Rockets. He ends the season with the Mavericks averaging 16.6 points per game, 7.3 rebounds a game, and 67 games played. A lot of those, though, were really short minute totals. So I feel like some of these are kind of skewed. He obviously could have done a better job on the glass. He didn't get near as much rebounds as I think he did in Houston when he was averaging 10 a game, but some of that can be attributed to the 5 or 6 minute downfall, because he was able to sort of resurge his amount of minutes played by getting some heavier dosages there towards the end of the season when things were sort of just kind of redundant and the Mavericks were just in tank dome. But before that and some of the more crucial stretches, he obviously wasn't playing much. So that's what I would probably label the whole season for Christian Wood in his time in Dallas is disastrous and malpractice from an organizational standpoint, despite Christian Wood's shortcomings. And it's another, it's not as bad as Jalen Brunson, of course, not even close to the mismanagement that persisted within the organization front office there. But it's definitely comparable in the sense of kind of how the whole situation was treated. We didn't even talk about really the contract extension, the whole no-go on that, whether they offered it or shouldn't have offered it is, up for debate, but it didn't even seem like there were talks about that. And it was just very sketch for a guy that you bet on and gave up a first round pick. I don't care if it's a late first round pick, assets mean a lot in today's NBA, and we see how much trades go around, and the Mavericks would definitely like to have those 2 future second round picks right now instead of a guy that's leaving. And that's where I come to at the end of the day. They screwed up, and it's just yet another organizational mishap, Jaren. That's the only conclusion.
How many times? I was just gonna say, I was like, how many times have we said that this year? How many times have the Mavericks screwed up this year?
Yeah, I mean, like every podcast. I just don't know like what else to really say about this. Like the more you dive and delve deeper into the situation, it's just like, they didn't really do everything they could in this scenario. There was obviously a lot from Christian Wood's perspective that he could have done better as well. But at the end of the day, this is not, they are not totally blameless in this. Like they made this move, they gave up a first round pick. We have to hold them accountable. And regardless of which side on the totem pole you're at about his fit in Dallas, nobody can sit here on and just on a beautiful hill with blue bonnets all across it. The shout out to the state flower of the state of Texas. But nobody can sit up on a beautiful pedestal surrounded by flowers up on the hill and say that, the Mavericks, just had a bad fortune of luck with the Christian Wood scenario. And he just didn't, come into what they thought he was going to become at the player. Like we can all say that they blatantly screwed this up, and it just kind of is what it is. And that's the sort of scenario we're in, Jaren. If you would like to dish out your sustainability rating before we move on to Theo Pinson, we can rate Christian Wood out of 10 in terms of his sustainability going forward in his time in Dallas and other factors, of course, taken into account. We can go ahead and do that, but I really don't have anything else. It's just about as shitty a situation as it gets.
Yeah, quite literally.
I just thank God that they didn't give up more for him, and that he only is on a $14 million expiring. And at this point, all I can do is, give him his good riddance and hope that he's able to sort of refurbish his NBA career elsewhere.
Oh, and quote for quote, it's a salary dump. So even though we have Davis Bertans and Tim Hardaway Jr. on our contract sheet.
Well, if Kyrie stays, it really doesn't mean anything
really
because they don't have any cap space anyways, but that's a whole nother situation to get into. Obviously the Cato article definitely gave us a little bit of increased confidence that Kyrie's coming back after, Mavericks fans were sort of flipping shit after he was at the Lakers game. I think me and Jaren were sort of in
absolute disbelief.
In a sort of fake sort of manner. We were sort of taken aback, but I don't know how much credence we actually held to that scenario. So, that's all good and dandy. And I can't wait to get into the Kyrie podcast because that'll be fascinating. But, this is all I got, Jaren. If you want to just go ahead and dish out your sustainability rating for Christian Wood in his time in Dallas.
We'll do, this will be the first time we do 2 for one player.
Oh, that's the lowest we've gone out of 10. Have you noticed the last 8 players, we haven't gone above like a 4?
Yeah.
I think that points to some major roster overhaul that's going to hopefully be happening this summer. But
hopefully,
knowing the Mavericks, Jaren, there's always the next move that never happens.
There always is the next move, and it's re-signing Theo Pinson. So
yes, we'll be talking about next. But I personally, for my sustainability rating, I'm going to go a 2.5, just because there is some sort of crypticness with some of the Twitter likes that actually kind of point towards him liking the Mavericks, but maybe just not the coaching staff. But I think he likes the culture here. Like it seems like he likes the culture and he likes the city here, and he likes the way the fans have treated him. Like he liked the post saying that he'd be back here when he was at a Canes event for the team in January, before the whole contract negotiations and trade deadline stuff persisted, and he was still playing well before his thumb fracture, all this sort of stuff. But I think just with the whole coaching staff front office scenario, it's just too much of a, you're doing yourself a disservice if you legitimately think he's going to come back, unless we get some more information. So we'll see if Tim Cato drops any more bombshells that tell us otherwise. But that's where I would probably operate right now, is at a 2.5 out of 10. But if you want to dive into Theo Pinson for a much less elongated segment, probably maybe it's going to be 1/25 of how long the Christian Wood scenario was.
Yeah,
we can go ahead and do that.
Here, let me dish out my sustainability ratings.
How about for Theo Pinson, I'd like you to take the way, Jaren. You go ahead and throw me the questions.
Okay, I'll throw you the questions on that.
Yeah.
Real quick, I'll list out my sustainabilities, and like I said, I'll do 2 for Christian Wood. His time in Dallas, as pretty much you just said, I'll stick with a 2 for every reason that you said. And sustainability in the NBA, I'll go with a 6.5. Because I do think that there is a role somewhere else, depending on who's alongside him, and the coach at hand, because clearly coaching does play an effect there. But I think, he's a good NBA player. I think, yes, there is improvements to be made all around in his game, but still, I think that he can find a role, whether it's off the bench or even starting for that matter, in another city elsewhere from Dallas. So I would put it a nice 6.5. But without further ado, the man that y'all were listening, or that y'all clicked on this podcast to listen to, Theophilus Pinson. We'll get into this one.
Theophilus.
Theophilus Pinson.
Theophilus.
I guess I'll list his counting stats, and then you will just give a brief overview of how you felt his season went, and in as much detail as you can, Will. So he actually played a career high 40 games this year. In 8 minutes, he averaged 2 points per game, 35% from the three-point line, 35% from the field goal line. So pretty much everything he took was 3, and that's about it. So
all right, yeah, he did a steady shot diet of threes in garbage time. But wait, so he averaged 35 from the field and from 3?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, interesting. All right, well, I mean, I guess I'll hash over some of his sort of strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
Theo Pinson, obviously, UNC product, was a guy that was very coveted when he was over there, facing off in the Final Four year after year against Jalen Brunson. I would say that, I would tend to agree with you with the Christian Wood thing regarding his sustainability as an NBA player, probably about a 7. I'd say, if it wasn't for Theo Pinson's antics and his on bench performance and, pining towards the referees and his importance as a locker room guy, then his, sustainability rating in terms of being in the NBA would probably be around like a 2.5 or a 3 maybe. And I'm not trying to be for lack of a better term, like I'm not trying to be a dick. I see a lot of people on Mavs Twitter blatantly throwing shade at this guy and trying to, just severely miscast him as a guy who shouldn't even be in the league or anything like that. I think he is a fringe NBA player. I don't think he's completely devoid of a skill set. I recognize what he has done to get to this level, and I do appreciate it. And I do think he adds something valuable to this locker room. And I think he even improved upon a few areas this year. I think we saw him opening up his array of playmaking a little bit more, even if it was in those garbage time scenarios. He was just a guy that was able to sort of serve as a cog in certain scenarios where I thought he probably couldn't. It wasn't for elongated or crucial stretches of the season, but I mean, post Kyrie trade for a little bit there, he actually had a decent role in the rotation. He threw an inbounds pass, I believe, in that Clippers game that was pretty key to us getting. I can't remember if it led to free throws or a basket, but it was really key to us closing the game. And he was trusting some late game lineups. It was the first time that he actually played somewhat of a role in the NBA, just given the Mavericks' lack of, rotation players, and he had to step up a couple times. And he did decent, just operating off curl offs, getting some cuts and, finishing at the rim a few times, as well as getting a few pick and roll scenarios. But the story of this guy's career in the NBA is just his inability to develop a 3-point shot. And, 35% is better. It's obviously not a high volume, so we're not going to take a ton of credence to that. But his story in the NBA in terms of what he can provide as a player sort of starts and ends at his inability to develop a shot and any sort of semblance of playmaking, because he's obviously this bigger guard that can kind of do a little bit of everything from, playing defense, rebounding, playmaking, shooting, but cannot do any one of those things good or great. And, being able to at least do one thing is just so important as a role player in the NBA in today's game. But he's just a sort of this all around guy, that does a tiny bit of everything, the ultimate sort of utility player. He could play every position in baseball if he was on the Rangers right now, who are doing much better than the Mavericks, by the way. So that's my synopsis for how he played. I'm glad he actually provided a role. I still think he's maybe a fringe NBA rotation player at best, but as the 15th guy on the roster, I don't necessarily hate it. You're not going to find a lot of value at that position anyways. And at the Mavericks are at least 10 deep, I'm not really, 10 to 12 deep, I'm not complaining whatsoever about him being the last guy. The questions arising about him being the last guy are a little bit more harsher when the Mavericks were as devoid of talent as they were last year, and they were searching at the back half of their roster for talent. So I think that's where some of the criticism applies. But if we had in the 2021-2022 playoff run, he was just a meme and everybody loved him. So, I think it's just going to be sort of conducive to the situation around the team. And, I don't know if he'll be able to develop. I think he's about 26 or 27 at this point. I don't know if he'll be able to develop into a guy that is going to get consistent minutes ever in his career. Maybe he does as a veteran one day, but he's going to have to get good at one thing would be my biggest improvement he's going to need to make. And I'd say his biggest improvement from last year was probably his ability to play make a little bit better. We saw him get involved in some of those pick and roll scenarios and be able to facilitate in the lob game a little bit more than he was in the previous year. So that's kind of what I would diagnose in terms of the full player portfolio of Theo Pinson. And unless you have anything to add, we can go ahead and move on to the surprising stat that you found and his sustainability rating.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to go ahead and, with something, I guess, kind of surprising, or at least something that surprised me was, kind of his increased playmaking, or at least his ability to sort of be that utility guy. Because at the end of the day, I would best equate him to a Dollar General Draymond Green. Of course, he's not a big or anything like that, but he kind of brings sort of, a general aspect on the floor that, Draymond Green kind of proposes. So I think
he's not an elite defender, and he's not
an elite defender. He's not an elite offensive player. He just plays basketball. He'd be the elite 24-hour guy. So.
Yeah, but don't make no mistake about it. Like Theo Pinson would screw any of us up at 24-hour fitness. So I'd please cancel the discourse that he is like just a bad basketball player. I don't want that narrative going around, but obviously, like, comparable to guys in the NBA, he's definitely at the fringe in terms of staying there.
Yeah. But I mean, this was, I think, his biggest role throughout this season that he's had in his whole entire career. I do know, Will, you got this wrong. I actually have something went up on you. His rookie year, he actually had a little bit of a role in Brooklyn at the end of the season, but that was pretty much about it.
You're the one who gave me the stat in the first place, so it's more on you anyway. So I don't want to hear that shit. So don't try to make that argument. But good for him. Good for him.
But yeah, his role being the inbound passer was one that was conducive to Theo Pinson. But yeah, I think pretty much everything you said was about on point. So I guess we'll dive right back into the sustainability rating. I'll go with this
you missed your surprising stat.
I was gonna go with the sustainability real quick. I want to say
okay. You want to do
the best surprising stat that we have out of any player right now. So
okay. I didn't know this. So
it's this one's coveted. I'm coveting this one high. So
all right.
My sustainability rating, because I do think that he probably will have a role in Dallas. Being another sort of bench guy, I'm gonna put it at a crisp 3.8. We're going a little different than the 3.5 or 4. We'll go with the 3.8.
Yeah. He's an unrestricted free agent coming up, or is he still on a 2-year deal? I believe he's an unrestricted free agent.
He'll be I thought he was signed to a 1-year deal. Or was it 2?
So he's an unrestricted free agent, so I'm sure he'll likely be back. Yeah, because I've seen all the memes about, Maverick's biggest offseason move and him quote tweeting that. So I think I'm gonna go a little higher than you. I'd say it's a 6 that they bring him back. As long as they make the other proper moves, they just bring him back on a vet minimum. For the vibes and what have you. I think they need at least one vibes guy. But I don't think it should come at the expense of adding talent. If they need talent that badly, then they should leave him by the wayside. But we'll see what they end up doing with him. What's your surprising stat, Jaren?
My surprising stat, this goes hand in hand with the beef that they had earlier this year. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you're living under a rock. Theo Pinson has more triple doubles than Dylan Brooks, and I'm just gonna leave it at that.
That was a good one. That was the best one we've had so far. Theo Pinson has more podcast plays than the Mainstream Mavs podcast.
He does. Oh, he does.
On the Title League podcast. Yeah, he beat us, so we suck.
Podcaster for podcaster. He should give us a shout out now.
That was our season review about Christian Wood and Theo Pinson. We will be back either tonight or tomorrow releasing another podcast covering the Tim Cato article as well as the Mark Cuban quotes. But we appreciate you guys for listening this far in the podcast. If you made it, hopefully you thought our season and reviews upon Christian Wood and Theo Pinson, respectively, were accurate to the eye test. If you don't think that they are, you can hit us up on Twitter and fight against us and take on our takes in a sort of first take fashion. We will be quick to respond.
How many arguments have we gotten into on Twitter? We got into a recent one.
It's a weekly occurrence. We try to keep out of it, but every once in a while, the gears are grinded to the forefront, and we gotta just lash out. But no, we're just joking though. We seriously enjoy interacting with you guys, and we are very friendly, and we try to see both sides. So if you ever, unless you're just blatantly spewing, some BS out in the comments. We're not
Mavs fans.
Yes. Oh yeah, stuff like that. And we're not gonna say anything mean to you. And we never take things personal. So don't worry, guys. So follow us on Twitter at mainstream_Mavs. Make sure to follow us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star rating, and give us a review as well. If you really enjoy our show and you've listened this far in the podcast, we'd really appreciate that. We're on almost any podcast platform that you could even fathom listening to. So you can find us anywhere. Also, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you are listening on YouTube. Comment how many dollars Theo Pinson is going to make with the Dallas Mavericks this year, and is he going to make more podcasting than on his NBA contract? Is the Title League podcast going to ascend to the next level and surpass mainstream Mavs for all of time? And with that, you guys comment that on the YouTube if you're watching. I have nothing else. I hope Theo Pinson, I'd say he's our main competition now as a competitor, Jaren.
He is. I think, we set the bar high, and I think we're going to elevate our game and become better than the Title League podcast.
That's the goal. We does that put us in a position to where we need to sign a veteran minimum deal to join the Mavericks next year to have that on-court experience to share on the podcast?
I think we sign a veteran minimum deal with the Texas Legends, and then we'll build our way up.
You might catch us, Scott. You might catch us at the Comerica Center this fall. So book your tickets in Frisco. Other than that, we will catch you guys in the next one.
Bye-bye.